ultimately, that's what I want you to think about as you're learning and understanding these tests. It's like, yeah, it's really cool to throw somebody on the table and show the movement limitation, do something, and then make that movement limitation disappear, so to speak, right? But ultimately, what I want you to be able to do is go into the gym, just have people move, perform their exercise activities, and then be able to coach and cue them with that understanding.
Good morning. Happy Tuesday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand and it is perfect. All right. Busy Tuesday, clinic day as usual. So we're going to dive right into today's Q&A. This is a conversation that I had with Andrew, and Andrew's in a really cool place in his evolution as a coach. So he is working on becoming more reliable with his table tests and his interpretation. So we're actually going to talk through some of that. We're going to use a little bit more of a shoulder frame of reference in this one, but we also talk about some of the conformations that we use as checks and balances in the hip. And so we're going to talk a little bit about iterations and such that are very important when you're learning how to interpret these things. Ultimately, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to eliminate the table tests from necessity and hopefully train the eye to be a little bit more effective using table tests only when we need to as confirmations or when we do get stuck, and we do get stuck because this is very complex, it is very gray, and as I like to say, the measurements tend to be a little dirty anyway. So, Andrew, thank you for your participation and your question. I will see you on the Coffee and Coaches conference call as we always do every Thursday morning at 6 a.m. So everybody have a terrific Tuesday, and we will see you tomorrow.
And the clock has started. What is your question, Andrew?
So in the past year, I have started to use your sort of retest method. And I've really incorporated table tests into all of the work that I do with clients as a way to see where their body's at, so to speak. And it's really, really good. It's been perfect for all of my interactions with clients and my work with clients. It's been very illuminating in terms of, directions that I need to take to help them. And I realized recently that I don't understand the utility of certain table tests that you mention in your videos. Yep. And not that I understand the ones that I do all that well in the first place, but I have some idea.
Okay.
So specifically, the ones that I'm wondering about, just to kind of narrow the focus, are shoulder and hip, if we have time for it, adduction and abduction. And I am unsure of how or if there is a difference in what, let's say, a shoulder abduction test would tell us about dorsal rostral expansion, right? Versus what an overhead flexion test would tell us about dorsal rostral expansion in that 90 plus range.
Okay. So let's use the shoulder example first. Okay. All right. So if we look at the way that the lungs fill, if you're taking a breath in, because of gravity, it's kind of like filling up a glass of water. So the lung would fill from the bottom up. Okay. And as we're going to assume like upright stance under these circumstances. Okay. And so as the lungs fill, there's certain space that you would be able to take up. So I would have to have certain expansion capabilities to fill that lung up. And based on the way that it fills, it actually provides us a physical shape that allows us to access movement. Okay, so that's what we're doing. When we're measuring people on the table, what we're doing is we're using these movements to identify where you can expand it and where you compress. If you compress, there is typically going to be a limitation in a specific range of motion. So when we're talking about horizontal abduction in the shoulder compared to flexion, there's going to be different spaces in the posterior rib cage where we're going to be able to expand to be able to access those movements. Because what I have to be able to do is change the physical shape of the rib cage the position of the shoulder blade relative to the upper arm bone, relative to the humerus, to be able to access some motion. So when we're talking about something where we would use like a horizontal abduction test in the shoulder, that's going to be representative of part of the dorsal rostral area. So the dorsal rostral area means the upper back, real simple, okay? But we're going to talk about a very specific area, which is probably going to be somewhere in the general vicinity of sort of the middle of the shoulder blade to the bottom of the shoulder blade. And again, we're talking about gradients of fill here. So it's not going to be an exact thing, but again, we can use it sort of as a target. So when we talk about dorsal rostral expansion, this is what we're talking about under most circumstances. So that horizontal abduction measure is going to tell me that you can or cannot fill up that space.
Okay.
If we're going to go overhead farther, that means I need more fill higher up into the rib cage. So now we're going to talk about that space that's above what I just talked about. So now we're talking about sort of that middle of the shoulder blade all the way up to the top of the shoulder blade, which is going to be roughly, it's going to be somewhere between, from T2 is the top of the shoulder blade to the middle is about that T5 area. So we're going to talk about filling up that space. And for me to access an overhead reach in external rotation, so we got to be really specific about this because we're looking at external rotation measures. Our shoulder flexion is going to provide us a measure of external rotation. Our horizontal abduction are going to provide us a measure of external rotation. So to be able to access both of those positions to whatever would be their full excursion, I would need expansion in both of those areas. So now if I measure somebody and I see this limitation, what this measure is now telling me is you're not expanding in this one specific area. So guess what? If I know where you can't expand, I know what activities to start to select for you, because if I can help you create the expansion in those areas, I have now recaptured the ability to access movement that you didn't have before. Does that make sense?
Yes. Okay. So if you measured somebody and you did an overhead flexion test with the external rotation.
Yep.
That shoulder blade would be wrapped around away from the spine just a little bit, right? So it's going to be a little bit this way, and then it kind of does this upward rotation. And so the abduction test would be measuring a little bit more in the center. Right. So right. Because the shoulder blade is wrapping around this way towards my center. Okay. So
hang on.
Okay.
Boss. Hang on, boss. Okay. So if we're talking about flexion, am I correct? We're talking about to reach the end range shoulder flexion. Okay. So to do that, the scapula has to move into a position of inhalation in that posterior aspect of the rib cage. You would already have upwardly rotated the scapula in that position. So we're past that point. So what's going to happen now, as that area expands, it's going to move the medial border of the scapula posteriorly and away from the spine. So you had the part away from the spine, correct? Because I have to make a space there, right? So it's going to as in my definition of external rotation, so it's not the definition that would be traditional, because I talk about inhalation versus exhalation positions as ER and IR. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a space in that area. So you described the space correctly. What's going to be included in that is you're going to have that area of the spine from that middle area of the scapula upward, you're going to have the spine turning in that direction as well. Because if the spine doesn't turn in that direction, there's no way that you're going to finish that shoulder flexion measure. I have to have space. That posterior space has to expand, which means the scapula is going to actually tilt back and again, re-inhale, if you will, in that position. Does that make sense?
Got it. So I'm wondering,
like by traditional standards, it would be like this posterior tilt and then a little bit of I think it would be considered internal rotation, which is not correct. It's actually external rotation, because it would be described this as similarly as it would be in the pelvis. The way that the ilium moves in the pelvis and the way the scapula move are the same. And so that we should call them the same thing. And that's basically what I do.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess I'm wondering, because I can't even think of a circumstance because I haven't done the abduction test.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what would be a circumstance where either the abduction test would confirm like a suspicion from the overhead test or vice versa, because I can't even put myself in that head frame right now.
Well, so they're both measuring aspects of external rotation, which is valuable because now I have confirmations of what my capabilities may be. And so let's just say that I have one external rotation test that measures in the so-called normal range, which is actually just an average. And then I have two tests that are limited. Then chances of that one test that was actually supposedly normal, it's not going to be normal. So because I need all of the posterior expansion on the backside to have full external rotation capabilities. So I have three measures that I can confirm myself against. So now I can tell when someone is oriented in a certain position. So let's just say that I have somebody that has a thorax that is anteriorly oriented, but when I lay them down on the table, they tilt backwards. And so what that does is it would potentially magnify a traditional external rotation measure, and it can potentially magnify shoulder flexion. Okay, so now I have I have three tests. I have my abduction test, my external rotation test by traditional measures, and shoulder flexion that will all help me confirm whether I have that posterior expansion capability available to me. And if not, like I said, it tells me where to target, but it can also provide me information as to whether I have somebody that has actually fallen backwards on the table, because what that does is it actually turns the shoulder in such a way that, like I said, it would magnify a couple of my shoulder measures. So again, that's why these become valuable. That's why a battery of tests becomes valuable, because now I have confirmations. Okay. Now, here's the cool thing. Let's go back down to the pelvis for a second. So you talked about hip. Okay. So the hip is behaving the same way the shoulder does. So flexion, abduction, and external rotation measures are exactly the same in the pelvis as they are in the shoulder. So it's going to tell me whether I have that posterior aspect of the pelvis capable of expanding under the same circumstances. The cool thing about that, though, is that usually under most circumstances, unless I have a constraint change of some sort, like literally a structural problem, that upper thorax and that pelvis are going to behave the same way. And so when I have limitations in external rotation in the hip, I'm going to have limitations in external rotation in the shoulder. So now I got double confirmation. So I can actually use my pelvis measures and my shoulder measures against each other to confirm my suspicions as to whether, number one, am I measuring correctly? And if I am measuring correctly, which takes time, so you have to be reliable with yourself. Okay, that's what's important. So you got to take bunches and bunches of measures to get really, really good at it, so you can measure consistently. It's not about being able to measure exactly like someone else. It's you being reliable with yourself. But once I can do that, then I can start to use these measures if need be. Now, let me say this, okay? You don't always have to use your table test. In fact, if you're working with somebody in the gym, I would say that you might never need to use them once you understand what these tests represent. Okay. So if I know that certain tests are associated with expansion or compression in certain areas, I also know how you move through space during an exercise. So if I'm watching somebody doing like some sort of cable chop activity or cable lift or a press or a push or a pull or whatever it might be, and I see something that seems a little off as far as that activity goes, I know what area of motion you're trying to access. So again, if I was looking at, say you're watching somebody press overhead for whatever reason, and you see it that like they have to do this big lean to the side, they can't maintain a certain measure of shoulder position, I can actually use my understanding of tests to help me identify what the movement limitation may be that is causing this compensatory strategy that's being demonstrated. So again, this becomes very, very powerful because, again, I don't want to have to do the table test. If I can identify these things, if I can just take you through normal activities, I can watch you squat in the gym. I can watch you do split squats. I can watch you do toe touches. I can watch you do presses. I can watch you do pulls. And from watching you do those things and understanding how the movement relates to these areas of compression and expansion, I can now identify if there's a movement restriction or if you're using a compensatory strategy that maybe I don't want you to use, because some of them are very useful. Okay. But again, that's the decision that I have to make. Again, the table tests are not a necessity. They are to teach you to understand how we access these positions and movements. Once you understand them, you may not need them at all. Maybe there are confirmations at some point in time where because we all get confused. This is very complex, right? But again, once you get an understanding of where I should see expansion, where I should see compression. So my expansions are typically associated with finding that external rotation space. My internal rotations are more compressive. They're gonna give me a different representation of turning inward versus turning outward under certain circumstances. And so once I see those things, it's like I can watch somebody do a split squat across the gym, and I can say, "Uh-oh, I got a little bit of a movement limitation over there," and I can identify what it most likely is. And then I can say, I need to change your movement strategy. So, when we talk about, something like, again, split squat always pops into my head. It's like, well, when will I use an offset loaded split squat where I put weight in one hand and not in the other? And then where am I going to position that weight? So if I have somebody that I see across the gym and they're doing a split squat and I see that knee deviate laterally as they descend into the split squat, well, there's my signal that that person doesn't have internal rotation available to them at that point, and I want them to have it. Now I can say, okay, that's going to be your lead leg on a split squat, but I'm going to put a weight in the opposite hand, so a contralaterally loaded split squat, and it's going to help you turn into that hip. So now you're going to have a greater likelihood of being able to access that internal rotation. So ultimately, that's what I want you to think about as you're learning and understanding these tests. It's like, yeah, it's really cool to throw somebody on the table and show the movement limitation, do something, and then make that movement limitation disappear, so to speak, right? But ultimately, what I want you to be able to do is go into the gym, just have people move, perform their exercise activities, and then be able to coach and cue them with that understanding.
I mean, makes perfect sense. And I have since the beginning of the year, I've gravitated away from doing the tests frequently. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no perfect process, right? But
right.
I think it's really useful. It seems to me that it's very useful when you start working with somebody, or just every once in a while, especially if they're somebody in pain, to do the full battery of tests, as long as they appear to be on board with that direction. But I have noticed that the more you do them with a specific person, the more you start to see what's going on, and it just relates across contexts. So that's good to have that confirmation.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's fair that again, if this is within your scope and this is within your capabilities, then I think it's okay. But ultimately, like I said, and I think in your situation, where you are in your career, it's probably useful for you to have this understanding of them. I don't know to what extent you would need to use them, but again, if it provides you confirmations, if it provides you some element of guidance, if your clients are okay with it, then I think that it becomes useful. But ultimately, it would be really cool when you get to the point where you just look across the gym and you go, uh-oh, I know what's going on. Here's what we're going to do. And then you intervene and then you see it clean up. Those are the really cool moments.
Right. And those happen very sporadically for me, but
but they increase in number over time. Okay. So this is an experience thing, which you will acquire over time, just like everybody else does. The one thing you have to remember that it is an investment of time, right? It's not about following a cookbook and saying, oh, this does this and that does that.
Mhm.
It's about understanding that we're playing in a very gray, complex area with a very complex system that doesn't behave the same way twice.
Right.
And that's why this is hard. Okay?
But it's a puzzle game.
It is. It is. Does that help you, young man?
Yes, it's very helpful. Thank you.